We're going to re-import our OBJ file. Just nicely opens up for us. We're going to make sure that the flip ZY axis is off. Usually, once you check this off, it all, that becomes the default. So we'll import. You can see we have our model here, just like last time. You can see it's made from a series of meshes, so on and so forth. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a series of lights, and these lights we're going to separate direct lights versus indirect lights or skylights. And so we're going to go to the Create tool on your right, and we're going to go to Lights. And the first set that you have are photometric lights. We're not going to be using those right now. We'll use one of those later. So we're going to open up this roll-down menu. We're going to click Standard. And the first one we're going to select is a skylight. So before I actually input this into the model, I want to show you what this renders like without the skylight, so that way you can see the difference between not having a skylight and then having a skylight. So Shift Q will automatically render the scene. And so right now it's just giving us this kind of average light layout. And that's because there are no specified lights. So we're going to create a skylight. And just like when we created the light last time, we're going to click and hold the object, and then we're going to release where we want to place it. Now, a skylight doesn't have direction. So unlike our system that was tied to a compass before, there is no compass. It has even light distributed in a kind of hemisphere around the model. And so it doesn't really matter where you place it, as long as I usually place it outside the model. I don't know if you really have to do that or not, but I feel like if you place it in the model, there can be some things that go wrong. So we place it outside the model. If we go to the Modify tab, we can see that with the skylight selected, we can turn it on and off. We can increase or decrease the multiplier, which just increases or decreases the intensity. We can change the sky color. And we can also use scene environment. And what that means is if you have an environment map, if I push 8 and open up my environment tab, if you've mapped an environment image to this, your skylight can actually take the color of that image and use it as a projection of light onto your project or your model. We're just going to leave that off for now. And you can alternatively, make it more or less blue. And I'll show you some interesting things with that a little later. And that's pretty much it. That's really all you need to do for the skylight. So now if we re-render this, we can see that now our skylight, and it's very speckled because we have relatively low settings on, but you can see that our skylight is starting to project kind of more from an exterior point of view down onto the model, so that on the inside of the model you're getting relatively dark light. So this would be pretty much analogous to an overcast day where you have light coming from all directions relatively evenly. I'm going to open up my render settings, render setup, and I'm going to go to global illumination. We're on draft, that's fine. We're going to go to common, and I'm just going to take it all the way down to 320 by 240. Hopefully that's enough to kind of see. That's fine for now. So now what we need to do is we have a skylight which kind of approximates our sky. We now need a direct light. And so we're going to go create tab, and we're going to go to target direct. Now the reason why we're going to use a target direct is because light from the sun hits the earth in relative, almost parallel rays. So if you were to use a spotlight or an omni light, you wouldn't be getting parallel lines. And so what the target direct light does is it creates a set of parallel lines. So we'll click that. We're going to click and hold again where we want the target of our light to be. I might have this backwards, we'll see. Okay, I'm going to redo that. I'm going to delete our light by clicking delete. So it's the other way around. We're going to click and hold, and that'll create the light itself. So you see this icon on the right. On the far right, that is the light. The little square that I'm now moving around is the target. And I'm going to put that target right in the model somewhere. And as default, it puts it on the plane of construction, your construction plane, which is, not necessarily where we want it. So I'm going to toggle into our top and right views. I'm going to navigate around until I find, so this is the top view of our light. This will work. This is the left view of our light. And now what we're going to do with the light selected, we're going to move that light by using the move tool up at the top, select and move. And you'll see this little XY axis here. In your perspective, it's an XYZ. In your top, it's a YX. So what we're going to do is we're just going to move that up by clicking and holding on the Y axis. And right now all I'm moving is the actual light itself. I'm not moving its target. And whenever I make lights, I almost always, with the exception of the Omni light, which doesn't have a target at all, it emits light in every direction evenly. I always have the light and its target. I never make a free light. I'll show you what that is. So over here, you can make a target direct or a free direct, a target spot or a free spot. And a free direct and a free spot, they basically just don't have a target down here. It's just the light itself. And I find that with the target, you have a little more control over how the light is directed. So I think we'll move this up a little bit more. If you want, you can have, if you want this exactly like the sun, you can create a system like we did last time, put the sun where you want it, and then replace the target light where the sun is, and just make sure the sun is off. But that seems fine right now, and then we'll move it like that. So now we have a target light, and there's a few things we'll have to modify with this light. The first is has to do with, let's see, is it directional? Yes, has to do with directional parameters. And right now you see that this little cylinder right here, that's showing where the light is and how far, and its fall off. So it's called its hotspot and beam and fall off. And right now they're at 43 units and 45 units respectively, which isn't quite big enough to actually cover our entire model. So I'm going to increase that. And there's a few ways you can do that. You can click on the up button and just scroll it up until it's around the entire model. And then I'm going to increase the fall off field. I don't know if you guys can see that. And what that does is it says the most intense light is this light cylinder, and then it begins to fall off to zero light in that distance, in this range. So as long as it's within that kind of our model, you can kind of just increase or decrease that however you like. So now we're going to go back to perspective, and we're going to see what the difference is when we render this. And so you can see that the difference in the light over here, that's because this is within the fall off range of the light. If I didn't want that at all, I could just increase it. But for the purposes of what we're doing, we're going to do some interior renders. I'm not really concerned with that at all. But you can now see that we have, and let me rotate around here. We have projected shadows, right, in the back, as though it were direct sunlight hitting the model. Okay? What we can do now is, now we need to set up a scene. And the way to do that is, there's not really scenes like there are in Rhinoceros or in SketchUp. They're actually cameras. And so it's an object that you create. So we're going to go to the Create tab. I'm going to open up my Windows. I tend to do this from like a top-down or a plan view. I'm going to go to Cameras. And again, I'm going to do a target camera because I like to be able to control both the camera and what it's looking at. Click on that. We're going to do a view. We'll do a view from here, and then I'm going to click and hold, and then when I release, it'll give me the target. And since that's in the plane of, it's kind of in the ground plane right now, I'm going to move it up to right around what I think is maybe 5 feet. I'm then going to select by name the camera target, because it can be difficult to select it within the model, and move that up. And now I want to see what is that view. So I'm going to left click on what's perspective here. You can left or right click, it doesn't really matter. And I'm going to go up to cameras, and I'm going to select camera 1. And so now we can see that camera 1 here's the view for camera 1. Here's this kind of corridor in the back. There's a wall surface in front of us here. And if I move the camera, obviously, in the model, it changes that perspective. Alternatively, if I have the camera active, I can zoom in and out just like a normal camera. I can change the field of view. So if we want a little bit more context, we can change the field of view. You can change the perspective distortion. You can rotate the camera. You can roll the camera. And if you click and hold, there are a few different options under each of these. So this is rotate the camera about the target. And this is rotate the target about the camera. Does that make sense? Is that clear? So in this case, if I start to rotate, the camera stays still, but the target moves. And in this case, the target stays still and the camera moves. So I like this view. It shows an opening here. Here we have this kind of little courtyard. We have the corridor, and we have a piece of furniture for some scale. And what I need to do, though, is I don't necessarily like this vertical distortion. Right now, this is a true kind of 4-point perspective. Geometries are fading in perspective vertically, both up and down, and they're fading horizontally, both left and right. I just want that left and right perspective. That way, if I render this, these columns will be vertical, truly vertical, so that if I compose it on a board or something like that, there's no crazy geometries happening at the edge. And the way you do that is you add a modifier to the camera. So just like you do this with geometries or anything like that in 3ds Max, we're going to take the camera and we're going to modify it with a modifier. And that's up here at the top. But first I need to make sure that my camera is selected. So I'm going to select by name my camera. And I'm going to go to modifier. I'm going to go to the bottom here where it says cameras. And I'm going to put a camera correction modifier on it. Right, I'm going to apply this modifier. And by default, it automatically applies a 2-point perspective correction. So now it's a 2-point perspective rather than, a 4-point perspective. And you can see that all of my columns are now truly vertical. If I delete this modifier, oops, I deleted the camera. Control Z will bring it back. If I delete that modifier, you can see how the columns went back into being distorted. So, applying camera correction. You can also change this. If we put in different numbers, you can see it starts to distort the image in various ways, but we're going to keep it at 90. And we'll start a quick rendering just to see what that looks like from the interior. So what you can see is that we have direct light coming into the scene, both through this opening and through this opening. I haven't applied glass. We're not going to cover that in this tutorial simply because glass isn't an important aspect of this particular model. And I did that for a very particular reason, because you don't always need to import glass or have glass as a material in your project. The reason why is because it often increases the rendering time significantly. And if it's not making a substantial impact, so right now I'm having interior rendering, I just want to see how light comes through a transparent medium. I'm not concerned about the reflectivity or anything like that, but if you were concerned about reflectivity of glass surfaces or translucency or color, that's when you would want to, in your Rhino model, create a 2D surface and then use that to apply materials. So there is no glass here, it's just open. And so we have direct sunlight, and you can see that some of this direct sunlight is increasing there's diffuse bounces which are increasing the brightness of certain surfaces, but you can also see this halo that's kind of moving around in the back here where there's an opening around here, and that's from the skylight. The skylight is projecting diffuse light into the rendering. Now, in when you don't have a very complex model such as this, you can just leave that skylight. But I'm going to show you how we can actually amend, how 3ds can by adding what's called a what's called an MR Sky portal, can actually reduce the rendering time because it starts to, how do I say this? It kind of abbreviates the calculation process. So right now it's emitting all these lights, and what we're going to do is to our windows, to our openings, we're going to add an MR Sky portal, which helps 3ds Max reduce the calculations necessary in order to get diffuse light into the building, and it gives us a little more control. So we're going to do that right now. So we've created a direct light, we've created a skylight, and now we're going to create what's called MR Sky portal, and that's under Create Light Photometric. This really helps if you have more complex openings, but it'll work here as well. It also tends to give you a more smooth fall off of light, a little bit more control. So the way you do this is, by the way, an MR Sky portal only works if you have a skylight. So if you don't have a skylight in your scene and you add an MR Sky portal, nothing's going to happen. The MR Sky portal is tied to the skylight itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to, I kind of know this model, so we're going to take select MR Sky portal, and we're going to put it just over the openings in our model. So I know I have an opening here, and if we look in plan, that opening is basically right here where this purple mullion is. And this is just a single surface, and it has an arrow connected to it. So you can see, well, maybe you can't see that. There's a little white arrow right there. Do you guys see that? Basically, that defines which direction the light is coming into the scene. So it's moving that direction into the model. And we're going to take that, and we'll make another one. Let's see. There's some other openings. Where are they? Oh, I'm on the wrong side of the building here. Back. No. Here, okay. Right here. So we'll create another MR Sky portal. It doesn't have to be perfect or exact. All it's doing is helping 3ds Max calculate diffuse light through an opening from the skylight. And then we're going to create another one towards the back here. And in this case, this one's on the other side of the pavilion. So I need to reverse it. There's two ways you can do this. You can either rotate it 180 degrees, and I'm going to turn on my angle snaps to do this. You can do it that way. You can alternatively, you can modify it to, flip the light flux direction. So I'll zoom in on here. So here's that little arrow. And if I click that, it reverses the direction of the light. So we're just going to leave that off since I already rotated it. And the last one I'm going to do, okay, I got one opening over here too. You can also copy these by holding down Shift as you move it, and then you can create an instance if they're the same size. Create another one. I think this one's all the way on the other side here. Like I said, I know this model, so I know that's an opening. And then there's a skylight right here, courtyard opening. So I want to create another one on top and move that up. And then make sure it's pointing the right direction, which it looks like it is. Yes. Okay, so what these do, again, it's not really anything important, rather it just reduces the kind of calculation time, and you get a more accurate calculation of diffuse bounces through these openings. But so since the settings were so low, we might not see much of a difference at all. But in higher settings with higher resolution, you'll notice that the diffuse bounces are far smoother once you've applied an MR sky portal. You can kind of see it's falling off a little further. But the real advantage of this is now I can control how bright each one of these MR sky portals is in every single opening. So let's say back here, right, at the back end of this hall where the light is coming from the right, if I think that's a little too bright, what I can do is just lower the multiplier on that MR sky portal, and you'll see a reduction in light coming from, oops, wrong button. So this one, which is all the way in the back corner on the right. If I modify that, I can take the modifier all the way down to, like, oops, let's say half of its original intensity. And if I re-render that, we could see that this back area is now a little dimmer than it was before. So it's not quite as intense as it was before, and that looks a little better to me. You can always play with these. All of these settings are kind of like adjustable, which is why it's really important to do like low resolution, very fast studies all the time, and then when you're ready and you know it's going to be right, spend the 2 hours or whatever it takes to actually render it in full. The other thing that we can do is, light from the sky might not be the same color as light from the sun. And in fact, you can actually create really interesting contrast between warm light from the south and cool light from the north. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select some of these skylights. So I'll select, we'll do it to, no. We will do it to this northern light, and then we'll also do it to the top light. So just do the top light now. We're going to modify it, and we're going to change the filter color from pure white to a kind of blue. Now you don't need to do this too much, and I'll show you. We'll crank it up, and I'll show you what happens to the scene when we render it. It's like super blue, right? We don't want that. You really don't need to add that much color to light in the project, and so you can see that looks pretty unnatural. I just want a little bit. I keep doing that, sorry. Trying to remember which. So we're just going to add just a tiny little bit, and you may not even really see it up there, but it's probably enough. I'll make it a little lighter too. Okay, then we'll also do it to this skylight, or MR portal, sorry. If these were instances of one another, obviously if you changed one, it would automatically change the others. And I'm going to do it to this one too, just because it's kind of closer to us, and it'll give us a better understanding what is actually changing. And then what I'm going to do is, let's render it again, so we can kind of see what's happening. So now you can see it may not be showing up there very well, but on the computer screen, it's just there's this little slight blue that's kind of filtering into the space, particularly on the edge of where the diffuse light is hitting. I think the projector probably doesn't have enough color range to do that. The last thing we want to do is actually create a warm light with the direct light. So in order to approximate what the kind of condition of the sun. So I'm going to select the sunlight, or the direct light, sorry. And in the same way I modified the color of, let's see where, it's in one of these rollouts. Oh, intensity and color attenuation. Okay. In the same way that I adjusted the color with the MR portals, I'm going to adjust the color of the sunlight. But in this case, I'm going to give it kind of a orange yellow. And again, you don't need much. I'm going to crank it up here just to show you the impact of really adding color. But then we'll pull it back. You can see that the sun, obviously here, this is way too yellow. Right? So you don't need much. And what will happen is we'll get this really nice, relatively natural distribution of colors where direct light tends to warm the space and indirect light tends to cool the space, at least with white surfaces. And again, you might not see too much contrast up here, but on the screen I can just start to sense that contrast. Okay, so that's how you can really start to control by breaking lighting apart. You actually have more control over the intensity. So if I wanted this space to be a little brighter, if it looked too dark, I could actually increase that. What's really important to remember or to recognize right now is that we do not have an exposure control system in place, right? So if we go to exposure control, right now there is no exposure control. And we actually want to keep it that way because our exposure control is based on the intensity of the lights. It's not based on how much light we're getting through the camera. Does that make sense? So if I want the scene to be brighter, I just increase the intensity of the lights. I don't increase the exposure of the camera. And it's to illustrate that, if you use like MR photographic exposure control, but you have standard lights, you're basically trying to balance two things at once rather than just one thing. So not only am I increasing or decreasing the intensity of the lights, but I'm also having to worry about exposure. And so if I re-render that, either you're going to get nothing like this, or you'll get something really white, and you just don't need to do that. It's overcomplicating the situation. So we're going to leave this off as no exposure control, and we're going to control the exposure with the lights. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. So we have these lights. I want to show you one thing. If we, for instance, if we let's re-render this really fast just to give you kind of a bearing. So here we have a relatively, I think this is relatively balanced actually, between the diffuse light that's happening and the direct light. But let's say we wanted that direct light to be not as bright. All we'd have to do is select the direct light itself, and let's say we'll cut it in half, its intensity. We will re-render, and you'll notice that the intensity of the direct light is obviously lower. So not only are the shadow lines, the contrast between the shadow and the light is less, but also the scene as a whole is receiving less light, right? You're getting less diffuse bounces, and so it's a little darker. So that's what I mean by controlling the intensity to control the exposure. So for now, since I like that, I'm going to put it like maybe 0.8 or something, quite as intense. Leave it at that. The last thing we need to cover is material manipulation. So I like our lights, they're okay. We can obviously do a lot more or less with it. And now we need to apply some materials. I'm going to show you, we're just going to apply two materials, and I've already set them up. So it'll go relatively quickly, but I'll show you where I got these materials or what's important about them. And actually, when you download 3ds Max, it comes with an entire library of relatively useful materials that include both diffuse maps, bump maps, cutout maps, and we'll explain to those explain to you what those are. So I'm going to push M, and M opens up my material editor. And right now, like I said last time, it's in the compact mode, but as default, when you first download the program, it's going to become Slate Material Editor. If you're interested in doing that, go for it. It might lead to some really interesting things. And right now, I'm just going to ignore all these standard things. I'm just going to go right into their basic mental ray material, which is called Arc and Design. And if I click on Arc and Design, you can see that there's standard materials, which we usually want to stay away from because they're older materials. And then there are mental ray materials, which are kind of designed to work with mental ray. So in here, I can choose from a series of templates, whether I usually always just choose either matte, pearl, or glossy, depending on how reflective I want the material to be. But there's also a whole series of other elements like glass thin geometry and solid geometry. And these are always abbreviations of the material. So if I select rough concrete, it doesn't really look like rough concrete. It's a kind of bump map that's used to approximate rough concrete. What's better to do is actually find an image and map it onto the surface. And that's what we're going to do now. So I'm going to go to this default material, and I'm going to scroll down. Here is where you can actually control like how intense the diffuse map is, how rough the surface is. I'm going to go, before we go down, I'm going to select a map. Let's do glossy finish. So glossy finish will be relatively reflective. And you can see the reflectivity is 7.75. 1 would be perfectly reflective, like a mirror. And we'll just leave that for now. You can always adjust it later. And I'm going to go down to the bottom. I'm going to condense this a little bit so I can get it all on the screen. And there, I'm going to apply a map. I'm going to apply 2 maps, actually. The first one that's always open by default is special purpose maps, where you can apply a bump map, a displacement, or cutout maps, things like that. But first we want to apply a general map. So I'm going to expand that window, and you can see there's a huge selection of different types of maps you can apply. I've never really had I've never had materials that are or maps that are so accurate that I use more than just the diffuse map. So we're going to apply a diffuse color map, which has to be a rasterized image, a JPEG. I usually just use JPEGs because they're smaller file sizes. And I'm going to click on None, which allows me to apply at the top of this list a bitmap. And if you navigate into the material files within 3ds, you can actually find a whole series of maps that are available. I've saved a couple of them for this tutorial, and I've saved them in my own folder. In my materials folder. And so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of put a glossy kind of marble floor onto this, and then we're going to put a matte bumped finish stone onto this wall, slate stone. And the reason why I did this is 1, to show a glossy surface versus a matte surface, and 2, to show how the color of the diffuse map actually impacts the model itself. So we're going to select, this masonry stone polished white fine. This, again, I got this out of the standard material library for 3ds. We're going to double click that, and you can see very subtly right now that the material of that has changed to be that image. So it's actually projecting that image onto the surface of this material. We're not going to worry about the size. Usually if I unselect use real world scale, you can now see that you can see the seams now in this object. It really depends on the scale of your model and how the units are being read, whether real world scale works versus something else. I'm going to show you how to adjust this in the model later, so it doesn't really matter. So what we're going to do is I'm going to select the floor, and I'm going to click and drag this onto the floor. And you can see the color of it has changed to reflect the diffuse map, but I actually want to see the image on the model. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to left click on shaded. I'm going to go down to materials, and I'm going to do shaded materials with maps. I'm going to select that. And so now you can see that it's actually showing the image onto this material. Do you guys see that? Is that clear? So obviously that's way too big for the scale of this model. I could go into here and just click that and see if that changes anything. It doesn't. So what we have to do is we have to apply a map modifier, right? So just like we modified the camera for camera distortion, we're going to apply a modifier to this object to allow me to actually manipulate the size and scale of that material. And again, that's up in modifiers, and it's called it's under UV coordinates, and it's a UVW map. So UVW used to refer to the XYZ coordinates in most modeling programs. So we're going to apply a UV map to this mesh. So if I select that, you can see over in the Modify tab that we have the editable mesh, and it's been modified with a UVW map. So if I select that UVW map, I can move this map, I can scale it just like any other object in 3ds. So, well, let's see. Oh, I know why, okay. So under that UVW map, right now it's mapping it as a plane. And for some reason, a box always seems to work a little better. And so with this UVW map, I can scale it. Oops, I have the object selected. There. Normally I can scale it. What's going on here? Oops. Huh. Let's go back a little bit. So, I have the mesh. This always happens too. You'll find that out. For some reason, it's not letting me scale that. It allows me to move it. Reapply. I mean, maybe I have more than one object selected. What is this? Object 76 is what I want. I had the sky selected as well. That's what is happening. Okay, so now I just have the solid geometry selected. I'll go to modifier. I'm going to add a UV coordinate map, a UVW map. I'm going to select that UV map. I'm going to apply it as a box, and no. Let's try it really quick on this wall. Create another material. Working design is fine. Matte finish. I'm going to go down to a general map. Diffuse color, we're going to add a bitmap, this masonry stone. I'm going to apply that to the surface. See, there's the object which is too big, so what I need to do is I need to create a UV modifier. And it's still not letting me scale it. There we go. Okay, so at some point, maybe it's by default, the real-world map size was selected under the UVW map, which basically says the size of the model is dictating the size of the map, which means you can't scale it, obviously. So now I'll do that with the other material as well. But you can see now if I move it, if I have the UVW map selected, if I move it, I'm only moving the way the material is mapped to the object. And I can scale that. Maybe. Oh boy. There. I can scale the map in a variety of ways. So let's say I want like horizontal surfaces or vertical surfaces. And then what's really important is that you can scale the material so that your seams line up with the surface of the object. The thing I see all the time with a lot of student renderings is that they'll blindly apply a material and they won't understand that, like, you wouldn't specify, you know, this stone to be cut like that, right? You'd want the seam to actually match up with the seam of the roof. And so I'm going to make this a little larger because I have a half stone here. And then I'm going to try and move it back in place. That's actually pretty good. Just so I can barely see the seams on the bottom and the top, I can do the same thing horizontally. Just take some fidgeting around. That's close enough. You can get it perfect, obviously, if you want. And that tells me that, okay, this is perfectly mapped to that object. So I don't have to worry about, so I'm going to unselect that, so I don't have to modify it. I don't have to worry about like actually trying to scale it or size it in any way in the material editor. It's basically you're modifying how it's mapped in every situation to get it perfect. So if I render this, and then we'll come back and change that one, the floor. You can see now that this image is being mapped to that surface exactly how I wanted it to be mapped. If you change the size and scale, so if I wanted to also map this to this wall, I could rescale it however I want there in the same way. You can also see some reflections. I don't know if you guys can see that very well. Some reflections in the floor because it's a glossy material. And now we're going to go back and rescale that, that material map, now that we know why it wasn't scaling before. And that's because I had real world scale on. Same thing here. I probably won't take, if it ever does this, that means you have the object selected, you don't have the map selected. So Control Z, I do it all the time. I won't take a whole lot of time on this to get it perfect, but we'll try and get it somewhere close. Again, what I'm trying to do is line the seams of these tiles, that might be too much, so that they line up with the width of the corridor, right? So my corridor is defined by 2 widths of this material. I don't like that connection right there, so I'm just going to move it back a little bit, and there, you've got it kind of seamlessly put into the scene. I'm going to deselect the UVW map. We're going to re-render that. And now you should be able to see that material showing up in the rendering. Again, these are all draft quality, very low quality. You're not seeing a whole lot of resolution. But if you can see a little bit of that material showing up right there. Now what we want to do is each one of these surfaces has a texture to it, or could potentially have a texture to it, especially this wall surface. And right now all we have is mapped on there is a diffuse map. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to add a bump map. And what a bump map is, it's another rasterized image, a series of pixels, but it's a grayscaled image. And what it does is it tells the program to, based on the color of the pixel, whether that surface is coming out or in the plane of the modeled surface, right? So instead of having to model all of those little surfaces, like the texture of this wall, which would not only be very cumbersome on the modeling end, but would also be very difficult to render, we're going to use an image which distorts the surfaces or makes it appear as though the surface is distorted. You can make these on your own. If you have the diffuse map, you can convert it into a grayscaled image, and sometimes it'll kind of work and sometimes it doesn't. But again, 3ds has a kind of startup library which will help you do that. So we're going to go to the special maps, special purpose maps, and we're going to apply a bump map to this red slate. It's a bitmap. And right here is the bump map. So you can see it's a grayscale image, and anything that's black, it's going to look like it's in, right? It's going to look like it's depressed into the surface. Anything that's white is going to look like it's coming out of the surface. So we'll open that up. I know they're the same size image, so we don't have to worry about resizing that or anything like that. This is the image, as you can see. And now when we re-render, you may not see it in this small resolution, but you'll begin to see that when the sun or the direct light hits that surface, it'll actually start to project shadows and appear that it has a texture or a 3-dimensional quality to it. I really don't like this. I really should make these tiles bigger because you can start to see that it's tiling the image, but it's okay for now. So you really can't see the difference right now because of the resolution of the image, but it's there. And if you want to modify its intensity, we can increase this. So let's Let's do something crazy and do like 5. I don't even know if it'll go that high. It will. And now we'll see what the rendering does. Well, you can't really see too much of a difference. But by increasing the intensity or the intensity of the bump map, you'll either have more or less movement within and out of the surface of the model. We can do the same thing with this one. Even if it's glossy, we'll apply the bump map that comes with it. And now the nice thing about, like, if you have a glossy surface that has a certain texture to it, any reflections or light will actually be distorted by the bump map. And again, we probably won't pick that up in the low resolution of this image, but in high resolution, you'd start to see it. All right, so now we've learned how to map and modify images and materials onto surfaces. The last thing we're going to do is, let's actually show this rendering up here, is I want to see volume in the light. So basically what I want to see is I want to see those rays of light coming into the space in order to give it kind of a three-dimensional quality. And just like in objects or materials, we're going to add a modifier to the direct light. And what the modifier is going to do, right now you can just see the lights coming in, and this is fine. This is a relatively good rendering, but if you really want to have some atmosphere into the image, I want to see where those rays of light are coming in, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to select by name. Might go a little over, sorry if we go a little over, but I think this is really important to see. We're going to select the direct light, and what we're going to do is at the bottom, or in one of these rollouts, it's called Atmosphere and Effects, we're going to add a volume light. And we'll say OK. So now we have a volume light, and if we want to control that volume light, we'll select in the rollout tab and we'll click Setup. It'll bring us to our environment and effects. You can just push the number 8, or go up to rendering and open this window here. And you can see that in the scene we have a volume light that's been added. And that volume light has parameters beneath it, so that tells it, well, right now the volume light is attached to direct light 001. And there's a whole series of controls you can add here. Now I've done this as I was creating this tutorial. I went back and forth with different settings, and I know which settings will kind of look relatively nice in this scene. So I'm going to change some of these numbers, and I'll tell you what they are and why I'm changing them. So the first one I'm going to do is I'm going to change the density to 3. The density basically means how foggy the light is, how thick the light is. So in really large scenes, you may have to increase the density, right? But here we're just going to keep it around 3. I don't want it to be too thick. The max light, we're going to change to 80. And what that does is this is usually if you have a fall off. So if you can specify where the light starts to fall off, it becomes more dim. But it basically has to do with the intensity of the light that's coming through. We'll leave min at 0. And everything else will leave the same. We're not going to apply noise, but you could apply noise. So let's say you wanted dust particles floating around. Have you ever seen that coming through your window? By turning on noise and then using turbulence, you can actually specify little dust particles. It significantly increases the render time, so we won't do it right now. And that's where we'll keep it. What you have to keep in mind, though, and I'll show you what's going to happen. This may increase the rendering time, hopefully not too much, but what you'll notice is that the intensity of the direct light has now increased, potentially to like not an acceptable level. So you can see the light hitting the floor right here takes a little longer. It's like super white. It's washing out the material, and as it starts to render over here, you'll see the same thing. And that's because the modifier actually does increase the intensity of the light. So the way you have to do that is you basically go to the direct light and you lower its multiplier in order to offset that intensity. So it's actually not too bad, but you can see that it's really, really bright here right now. Do you guys see that? It's maybe a little more bright than I want it to be, but the volume light is adding these rays. And what's really neat is that any object that's in front of it, you can see like right here, there's a little dark shadow. That's because I have this kind of curved object and this just blocking some of the light. So what I need to do is I'm going to go select the direct light. Oops. I'm going to go to the Modify tab. And all the way at the top, I'm going to take the multiplier down to like maybe 0.3. And we'll render it again. And now you can see that, and this is all based on your preference. If you want a really intense light like that, that's fine. I just think that sometimes you can push it so far that it washes out the material that you're mapping onto. And so we'll see the result of this. You can start to see now the light is, maybe it's too dim now, but you can see the direct light's coming in, but we're still picking up on the material qualities of the floor. We're not losing that intensity. Right? Yeah, this might be a little too dim for me. Always increase it. But that's just kind of trial and error. We can also see that, maybe you guys aren't picking that up, but this wall is an L shape. And so we're seeing one side of it and it actually moves. I'll show you what I mean. This wall is kind of an L shape. Do you see it? So it also has a red surface on the other side that we're not seeing. And the light that's hitting that surface, it's actually coloring this surface just a little bit red. And that's because the light that's hitting the surface, it's then bouncing off, it's picking up that red color and it's depositing it on the next wall. So keep in mind that when you apply diffuse maps, the color of that diffuse map is actually going to kind of infect the spaces around it, especially if they're white surfaces, which are really receptive to color fall off. Okay? So that's it. We've covered how to import a model, how to set up daylighting conditions, how to increase or decrease render settings, and then most important, which I think you should all kind of come away with, is how to create really, really nice interior renderings, because they're very difficult to do, and from what I've seen, interior renderings almost always fall short of the exterior renderings. And so hopefully now you guys have the tools and the know-how to kind of create those scenes and manipulate them. You have a question?
Yes, I do. I have two questions. First one, so say you have to render both sides of this L surface.
Yes.
Is there a way to look into those maps?
No. The map is applied to the object. So the question was, just so we have it recorded here, the question was, since this is an L object, can you map this surface differently on different sides of the object? To illustrate why he's bringing that up is because the surface over here might not be correctly mapped versus this surface. But if I render from this side, I'm going to see both sides, obviously. You cannot. So since it's mapped to the object, it's going to change it with relation to the object, which means if you want to map it on different surfaces in different ways, you need to basically create two objects and apply the map separately to those objects. Does that make sense? So I might model this wall as one object and this wall as another object.
And the second question, maybe this question you know, and I don't know, and I don't know in the program. That is, if I were to do an exterior rendering, I want to try to map some type of image. Is there a possible way to do this?
Say that again.
So if I'm doing an exterior rendering and I want to position my building.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, we'll talk. I should have covered that. Actually, a really good point. The question is, if I want to do, oops, let's move our camera. Let's say I wanted to do an exterior rendering like this, and I wanted to match it up with a photograph that I may have taken. How do I do that? Well, I would never say, never render the environment as the background and then just use that. So the only reason I would do this is to make sure the perspective is the same. Always add the background in Photoshop with the alpha channel. I'll show you what I mean in a second. But in order to line it up properly, it's all within the viewport configuration. So to cover that very briefly, if you go to Views, in this roll-down menu, there's Viewport Configuration. And if you, the window will pop open, and what we want to do is we want to look at the background. So we'll select the background, and what we're going to do is we're going to use a file. There's different ways you can do this. We're just going to simply use a file right now, and we're going to, let's see, open some file. This obviously won't be a usable image. These are all, again, standard like maps for, this is like a face.
Sample pictures?
Yeah, let's do that. Okay, sure. Maybe these penguins, right? We'll do this one. None of them are really at human scale or at human eye level, but so we've loaded an image, and if we press OK, that image actually gets loaded into the background of the model, right? So now I can like say, well, I want my maybe I want my house like, I don't know. Obviously, this image is not really conducive to what we're trying to do here. But to show you how you can actually line up the perspective so that it matches the photograph. Now, again, I wouldn't ever render. You can also say, if you go into Views, Viewport Configuration, you can use an environment background. So if we do use environment background, obviously the image might, well, normally the image goes away. But if we render it, no, okay. We actually have to go to our environment and load in that bitmap, that same bitmap. And then what will happen is that will render with your model, right? The reason why I say don't do that is because it'll actually render it as the image, and so you'll have less control over post-processing in the end, right? It'll become part of the rendering, which means the resolution of the image is the same resolution as the rendering, so you might lose some quality that you may want back. And it'll be harder to post-process because now it's actually part of the rendering, whereas if you just crop it in Photoshop later, then you can control both objects separately. Does that make sense? But a very good point. If you want to make sure that your view is aligning to some photograph, this is how you do it. You can actually map it into the background of your image. Does that make sense? One last thing is the image that I have, the resolution of the screen up here, it doesn't always match the resolution or the size and scale of my rendering. So there's a way to actually show that. Hopefully I can.
It's in the
Safe frames.
Yes.
There it is. Okay, yeah. So you can show a safe frame. So what this safe frame does is it says regardless of the aspect ratio of your screen, this is the aspect ratio of the image you will be rendering, right? So if I open up my render settings, the render setup, and I change this aspect ratio, you can see that all washed out because it's an exterior rendering now. You can see that the safe frame has now changed to be more accurate to the final rendered image. Okay? So we'll go to camera 1. So now this could be like a widescreen or something. You can open up an arbor. Under settings, I'll do just one really quick kind of higher resolution image, and then we'll leave it at that. So are there any other questions? Yes?
When you say a view, for example, when you like accept the question view that section and then you want to flip it and go back to that view, then you go back to it.
Yes. You have to stop thinking of it as a view or a scene, though, because it's the camera as an object. So regardless of how, if I'm in camera 1 mode and I change it, and you'll see this up here. So here's my camera. Can you guys see that? Right there, that blue camera. If I rotate my view here, I'm actually moving the camera as an object. So it's not a scene, it's an object. If I created another camera, I can always, so let's do that actually. Create another camera, target camera. We'll do a view from like over here. That's another camera, and now if I want to go to that camera, I just left or right click here, camera, camera 2. So you can create as many cameras as you want, and that's essentially like, saving a scene. What you have to keep in mind is now that I've created a camera 2, you can see now it has that distortion again. Camera 2 does not have the same camera correction modifier that camera 1 has. Okay? Any other questions? So let's do a quick, let's see. How the light might be different in this rendering from this side. And this will also illustrate, since I mapped this material to the other side, it might not line up perfectly with this side, which means I'd have to modify the UVW map if I want these slate stones or whatever to line up.
You have different, your working procedure. You have 2 renderings and you're looking at the object from different sides, you say that's different file.
Yeah, you could. It really depends, like how often you're rendering this or how often you're changing things. I would say if I were changing it like a lot, I would probably just create 2 objects or 2 surfaces, one that faces one direction and one that faces another direction. And then I would just not have to worry about it ever again, versus having to remap it over and over again.
So if you were to explode those 2 surfaces in Rhino and make independent objects, and then exported it?
They'd become separate objects, and each object could then take its own UVW map. There's one thing I really want we covered this briefly in the last tutorial, but I want to cover it again. When you make a mesh and you import it into 3ds, 3ds recognizes that mesh has a visible side and an invisible side. You may have seen this or experienced this with like SketchUp. So there's a setting, if you open up your render setup, in the common tab, right here, it's called force two-sided. So if you have an object that is just a surface, from one side it might be visible and the other side it might be invisible. If it's a solid, you don't have to worry about it because the solid is showing its outsides consistently. But if it's a surface, you'll have to click force two-sided, and then you'll see it'll render both sides as though it were a single surface. Does that make sense? So be careful if you explode something and do a series of surfaces in Rhino and then export it. You may end up seeing, like if it becomes invisible, it's because you don't have force two-sided selected. And we covered that very briefly on Tuesday. I just wanted to, that could be a really source of frustration if you don't know why that's happening. Yes?
I know that from SketchUp when I tried to get a different object with group, like say that like piece of furniture has the legs and the actual piece of it is grouped, that it's going to be material of all of it, like if it is grouped in the original file.
Right.
Does that apply to the same?
Yeah, there's a really simple way to get around that. Don't use SketchUp.
Well, right.
No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. No, I'm just kidding with you. Not really, but I'm kidding. Yes, so basically how, if you export a model from SketchUp into 3ds, if it's grouped, it's going to assume it's one object. So if that's the way you want to like, work in modeling, you'll have to make sure that all your groups in SketchUp are basically the objects that you want to apply materials to. Or the other thing is like, even if all of these columns were grouped, even if they're all the same material, I can only apply one UVW map to them. So if I had columns that were seen from different angles and they weren't cylinders, but they were something else, or walls, for instance, walls at different angles, if you group them, you're only going to be able to apply one UVW map. So you have to ungroup them in order to align the material properly. Does that make sense?
Is that the same way with Rhino? Like if you create Rhino,
I'm not entirely sure. You'd have to experiment with that and get back to me. So if you group something in Rhino, I'm not entirely sure that the groups will create objects in 3ds. I have a feeling that it won't, that you'll still have the separate objects when you export it as an OBJ file, but I'm not entirely certain about that. Any other questions?
Um,
I really want to do something relatively big so that you guys can kind of see quality.
do you, I mean, I don't know how it's here, but did you go over like how you modify the unit so that it's a little more reliable unit scale?
No, we didn't. And the reason why is because there is a way to make sure that the units come properly. I don't normally care about it because the only thing that really affects the units in the models are material maps. And since I'm mapping the materials at a relative scale with the UVW map, it never really seems to impact. So, for instance, like you might say, well, I want this brick wall and I want the bricks to be real world scale. There is a way to, in fact, there is a way to scale it so that you have a real world scale, but I find it very frustrating to do that, and so I always kind of go off of relative scales anyways. Nothing in this is so precise that you really need to do that. What I have found is that the scale of the model in real world scales in Rhino transfers through the OBJ file into real world scale. So this is a 10-foot floor to ceiling as scaled in this model. And you can do that by measuring, if you turn on your snaps, kind of want this rendering to finish. You can measure the distance between 2 points that you know the distance to, right? So you can snap from one direction, and it'll tell you the length of that. And if it's 10 inches instead of 10 feet, then obviously you just can increase the scale by a scale factor of whatever. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, I was more interested in changing the unit, going to customize interface that actually.
Yeah, that's.
My personal preference is to actually work with units because I like to sometimes render entourage into the view.
Mm-hmm.
So that way, you know, going back to Photoshop, I can actually get the scale right.
Sure. Yeah, I've never actually rendered entourage into the.
I do what you do in a different way. So in my rendering, I'll model cylinder, really done object and render really quickly. And as a consequence of that, I can create a line. Now, where people is where cylinder. So what I'll do is I'll do a rendering and then I'll do really quick even screen export at the same resolution. I'll overlay those two with Photoshop, and it's just a quicker way to go about it. But this is important that we sort of share our working methodology.
Yeah.
That's what the whole purpose of it is.
Yeah.
I can't come up with all solutions. I can't come up with all solutions. Professor really can't come up with all solutions. That's why you guys are here. That's why we meet. So we can learn all these solutions.
I'm always kind of just relative scale, you know.
If you go into customize tab,
There's a unit set up here.
You can set up, and then you can actually turn the feet and inches. That way, like if you want a specific fall off, and if you want.
Sure.
Map,
Yeah, and like so, you know, if I had a brick pattern here or something, and I use real world scale, then you would know that, you know, each brick is a certain size, or so on and so forth.
Are there any other questions?
So that's a little better, right? Oops. And the reason why it's speckled is, one, I have the final gather precision set very low, but I also have let's see, where is it? Oh. Noise filtering is at standard instead of like extremely high. So.
Can you briefly talk about what you would be doing differently if you were doing night?
If I were doing a night rendering, yeah, I mean, one thing we didn't really cover is artificial lighting.
I think we do the tutorial
On Tuesday.
Let's do this.
Okay.
Is that what we do?
We'll cover artificial lighting on Tuesday.
We'll probably do also want some animation or.
Yeah, we can cover basic animation too. We'll do that Tuesday.
Then we'll start some recording.
All right. Thank you.
And some of that stuff.